In the years since U.S. troops left Afghanistan, we've seen the Taliban take hold, the rollback of Afghan women's rights, and the killing of Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda. A question now lingers. What do experts think in retrospect? We asked two of my longtime sources, Lisa Curtis, the former NSC director under Trump.
Would it have been better to keep a small residual presence in Afghanistan?
And Justin Logan, director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute.
Couldn't we have kept that going forever? And the answer to that question is no, we could not have.
About how their perspectives on the withdrawal have changed in the last year.
I personally supported leaving a residual U.S. presence in Afghanistan so that we would maintain some leverage in the peace talks with the Taliban, and we would also be able to protect our vital counterterrorism interests.
The downside of leaving troops in Afghanistan would have been that the war was about to begin again. There's every reason to believe that the Taliban would have begun attacking U.S. forces again inside of Afghanistan. It's difficult to envision the United States having more leverage in a negotiation than it did during the Doha negotiations themselves. And it's certainly fair and true to point out that the Taliban violated the Doha agreement, but this suggests to me that they recognize they were much stronger than we wanted to appreciate at any point really during the war.
The peace negotiator made far too many concessions to the Taliban. It wasn't a peace process. It was a surrender.
If the willingness to fight and the political support for the Afghan government hung on such a thin reed as not negotiating the Doha agreements with the Taliban, then that government and that political constituency was even weaker than we thought.
Tens of thousands of Afghan soldiers lost their lives. It's not as if the Afghan forces weren't fighting for their country, because they did for many, many years.
The foundational political realities were that the Afghan government was a house of cards, entirely reliant on perpetual U.S. support. We were, again, maybe not going about it in the perfect way, but grappling with an unfortunate but intractable political reality, which was that the Taliban had a lot of political support in Afghanistan and were not going away anytime in the foreseeable future.
I think the biggest loss for protecting U.S. counterterrorism interests is the fact that we now have a regime in control of Afghanistan that is directly allied with al-Qaeda. We see that the leader of al-Qaeda felt comfortable enough to be in downtown Kabul. This, could be the start of the rebuilding of al-Qaeda and its base in Afghanistan.
I think the whole notion of a so-called safe haven doesn't appreciate how terrorism works. It's not as though if 100 al-Qaeda members can get together in some rugged part of Afghanistan, that equates to a threat against the United States.
I feel like we face more risk to a terrorist safe haven rebuilding in Afghanistan. General Milley, I think, testified on the Hill that al-Qaeda had the ability to build back up within the next, 6 months to a year.
After the Zawahiri killing, the U.S. intelligence community concluded that al-Qaeda has not been able to reconstitute in a meaningful way in Afghanistan that would allow it to use that as a sort of staging ground for attacks against the United States.
That might be overstating the case. I think the strike against Zawahiri does demonstrate that over the horizon can work. But the problem is that now I think what we'll see is al-Qaeda go more underground. I think it was a mistake that the Doha deal did not demand more of the Taliban when it comes to human rights and women's rights. These very women that our money and our investment empowered and brought hope to, are now being told you can't go to school, you can't leave your homes, you can't take most jobs, you can't travel alone without a male companion. I believe that the issue of women's rights and how women are treated really is connected very closely to the counterterrorism issue, because the more we allow these extremist ideologies to prevail, including oppressing women, the more you're going to see terrorism employed in the country. And that's something that I firmly believe, but unfortunately was not shared by others in the Trump administration.
Setting up a relatively liberal, relatively democratic country with a relatively broad set of rights afforded to women, religious minorities, etc., was beyond the reach of a $2 trillion 20-year U.S. war in the country.
We invested so much in improving human rights and civil rights and women's rights in the country that we do have an obligation to try to continue to see those rights preserved.
The reality is that at the end of the 20 years of war, the bad guys won. My view is that the U.S. national security implications are actually quite limited. If you want to bring in the well-being of Afghans to that discussion, I think that's an important aspect of this. But you can't shape the debate so that you're dodging hard realities. We've been in that country for 20 years. We can't just simply say we broke it, someone else bought it. But at the same time, some of the things that could be done to easily remediate the suffering of Afghans are not being done.
There are ways to get that assistance directly to the Afghan people. It's not easy, and some would argue that it's not as helpful as, just injecting the money, the reserves back into the banking system. But I would say that injecting the reserves back into a central bank that is controlled by the Taliban is way too risky.
The humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is a real crisis. 80% of the Afghan budget was provided by foreign aid, and for understandable reasons, that aid doesn't exist anymore. The United States is currently holding $7 billion of Afghanistan's central bank reserves, which is contributing to the humanitarian catastrophe that is going on in the country right now. And it is true, and I think, my own values conflict, that helping Afghanistan today is, in some sense, by extension, helping the Taliban. But I think you need to weigh the U.S. national security considerations against these humanitarian considerations. We're talking about the humanitarian considerations of leaving. These are going to pale in comparison to the humanitarian toll that much more unsexy subjects like food and water are wreaking on the country now.
The way the withdrawal was carried out was not helpful, and it didn't have to go that way. We certainly needed to draw down, but I don't think we needed to wipe it out altogether and do so quickly.
The Taliban almost certainly were likely to begin attacking U.S. forces again if the U.S. didn't keep to its commitment to withdrawal. And in that sense, I think it's important to sketch out what we're evaluating against what other scenario. So it's this unsatisfying, sad, bad withdrawal against something that is, in my view, worse than that, which is a perpetual U.S. war in Afghanistan to deny the unavoidable reality that the Taliban are going to be there in significant numbers and with significant political support whenever we leave.